Your presence here is a problem, the billionaire heiress said, and she didn't whisper it. She didn't need to. The dining room of the Ashcroft Grand had a particular kind of acoustics, all marble and high ceilings, and the careful silence of people who'd paid enough to expect it, and her voice carried exactly as far as she intended it to, which was far enough for the corner table to hear every syllable. Far enough for the couple at table 9 to stop mid-conversation. Far enough for the maitre d' to begin his practiced walk across the floor before she'd even finish the sentence. The man at the corner table didn't flinch. He didn't look up immediately. He finished what he was saying to his daughter, something quiet, something that made her laugh. And then he turned, and he looked at the woman who had just announced his problem to a room full of strangers. And he said nothing at all. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from, because the people who need this story most are scattered everywhere. And stay with me, because what this man does in the next few minutes will leave that heiress frozen at her own table in a way her money cannot fix and her power cannot explain. Caspian Morel was not a man who took up space loudly. He was 41, with the kind of hands that knew their way around pipe fittings and circuit panels. Broad, calloused, unhurried. He worked the third-floor mechanical infrastructure of this same hotel 5 days a week, which meant he knew every groan the building made before it became a problem. He knew which elevator cable needed watching. He knew the exact angle you had to hit the service corridor door to stop it from catching. He had worked inside the walls of the Ashcroft Grand for 3 years, and in that time, he had become precisely what buildings need and almost never acknowledge: invisible, reliable, essential. Tonight, he had pressed his good shirt. It was dark navy, a little short in the sleeve, bought the year before his wife got sick. He'd knotted a tie with the same focused patience he applied to everything technical, and he'd walk through the carved front doors of the Ashcroft with his 7-year-old daughter's hand in his, her other arm locked around a stuffed rabbit named Admiral, and he had felt, for the first time in longer than he wanted to count, something close to ordinary happiness. Nora had requested this dinner with the seriousness of someone filing paperwork. She'd found the restaurant listing in a city guide 6 weeks ago and circled it in red crayon. Real cloth napkins, she'd told him, and a candle in the dessert. He had checked the staff policy handbook, confirmed the monthly meal voucher was valid in any dining room, and booked the corner table on a Tuesday morning between a boiler inspection and a HVAC filter change. He'd told Nora on the drive over. She had vibrated with quiet excitement the entire way. They were seated promptly. Waiter brought water and menus and a small paper activity sheet with crayons, which Nora accepted with great dignity. She set Admiral against the breadbasket so he had a view of the room. She studied the menu with the concentration of a surgeon reviewing a chart. Caspian watched her. This was something he did, watching Nora, with the particular attention of a man who understood, at a cellular level, how fast things could change. She had his late wife's way of going still when she was thinking hard. The same slight tilt of the head, the same small frown that had nothing to do with unhappiness and everything to do with concentration. He had learned not to find that painful. Most days he had learned that. Her inhaler was in the front pocket of her cardigan. It was always there. The asthma was mild, well managed, and rarely made its presence known. But Caspian had understood, since her diagnosis at age 4, that preparedness was not anxiety. It was love expressed in practical terms, He checked for it the same way he checked the pressure gauges each morning. Not from fear, but from the quiet discipline of someone who knows that the moment you stop checking is the moment something goes wrong. The pasta with cream sauce arrived. Nora's eyes went wide. "Dad," she said, in the tone of someone receiving confirmation of a long-held theory, "this is a serious restaurant." He smiled. "You picked it." "I picked well," she said, and that was the moment, that exact, perfect, ordinary moment, when the woman at the center table looked over and decided they were a problem. She had a way of looking at people that made them feel like problems to be managed. Vivian Ashcroft didn't stare. Staring was graceless, and gracelessness was the one thing she'd spent 40 years refusing to accommodate. She observed, cataloged, assigned. It took her approximately 4 seconds to take in the corner table, the slightly too short tie, the paper activity sheet, the stuffed rabbit propped against the bread basket, the voucher the waiter had accepted without comment. 4 seconds, and she had assembled a complete picture, filed it under the appropriate category, and arrived at her conclusion. The conclusion was that this needed to be corrected. She didn't do it immediately. That would have been reactive, and Vivian Ashcroft was never reactive. She unfolded her napkin, smoothed it across her lap, and turned her attention back to her niece, who was arranging the crayons in a very specific order that apparently required total concentration. Isla was 6 years old and had her mother's eyes, wide set, very dark, taking everything in without seeming to. She'd arrived that afternoon on an international flight with a small rolling suitcase and a seriousness that didn't belong on a 6-year-old's face. 8 months since Vivienne had seen her. 8 months of legal correspondence and scheduled calls that Vivienne's estranged sister canceled more often than not. This dinner was supposed to be a reset, neutral ground, a beginning. Vivienne had chosen the Ashcroft Grand because she controlled it, which meant she controlled the variables. Or so she'd believed. She let 3 minutes pass. Then she raised one finger, almost imperceptibly, and Dominic Fare was at her side before the gesture was complete. Nico had worked for the Ashcroft chain for 11 years. He could read Vivian's signals the way a sailor reads weather, not from what was said, but from the precise atmospheric pressure of what wasn't. She said 4 sentences to him. Quietly, without looking at the corner table again, Nico nodded once and moved. Caspian saw him coming. He'd noticed the woman at the center table in the same moment she'd noticed him, not because she was remarkable, though she was, but because he noticed everything. It was not a skill he'd developed. It was a habit built over 8 years of environments where the thing you didn't notice was the thing that killed you. He'd been out of the army for 6 years, and the habit remained, as reliable and involuntary as breathing. He watched Nico cross the floor and recognized the walk, purposeful, apologetic, already preparing the softened version of whatever it was. "Mr. Merrill," Nico began, his voice dropped to the register reserved for uncomfortable conversations. "I'm so sorry to interrupt. There seems to have been a small complication with the reservation system. We have a lovely spot near the bar that would offer a bit more." "She's with me," Caspian said. Simple, level, not a challenge, just a fact, stated with the flat clarity of someone who has no interest in the performance of a disagreement. Nico stopped. He had a practiced response ready. 3 more sentences of warm deflection, and all 3 of them dissolved in the face of those 3 words and the absolute absence of agitation behind them. He held Caspian's gaze for a moment, found nothing to negotiate with, and, excused himself. Nora hadn't looked up. She was constructing something elaborate from the paper activity sheet, her tongue pressed to her upper lip in concentration. Admiral observed from the breadbasket. Nico returned to Vivian. Whatever he communicated, in the compressed, efficient language of long professional proximity, was enough for her expression to shift by exactly 1 degree. Not anger, something more refined than anger. The specific temperature of a person who has issued a reasonable instruction and been informed politely that it won't be followed. She pushed her chair back, and now Caspian kept his eyes forward, but everything in him became still in the way that still has texture. The particular quality of attention that looks like nothing and processes everything. He heard her footsteps. He heard the slight scrape of the chair beside him. Not his, the empty one at the next table, which she didn't take, just used as a mark of proximity. And then her voice, low and precisely aimed. I want you to understand that the staff voucher program exists as a courtesy. It isn't intended for spaces like this. The judgment involved in choosing tonight, of all evenings, to... Dad, Nora said, without looking up from her paper. What's a soufflé? He looked at his daughter. It's a kind of dessert, he said. Very light, like a cloud you can eat. Nora considered this with great seriousness. I want that instead. If you believe a man's dignity shouldn't depend on his job title, subscribe and hit the bell, because this story is just getting started, and what happens at this table next will change every person in that room. Vivian stared at the back of Nora's head for a moment. The child hadn't registered her presence at all. She was still bent over her paper project, crayon moving with the focused industriousness of someone on a deadline, completely indifferent to the fact that one of the most powerful women in the city was standing 18 inches away. Admiral the Rabbit stared up at Vivian from the breadbasket with the blank equanimity of stuffed animals everywhere. Something moved across Vivian's face. It wasn't softness. It was closer to recalculation, the brief, almost imperceptible pause of someone who has aimed at a target and found the target isn't behaving according to the expected parameters. She redirected. The voucher policy, she continued, her voice dropping further, pulling the words tight, was designed for the staff cafe on the basement level, not for... She let a small pause do the work. A gesture would have been too obvious to do. This. Caspian turned and looked at her fully for the first time. He didn't look away, and he didn't look hostile. He just looked with the steady and unhurried attention of someone who has sat across from much more frightening things than a woman in a $1,200 dress. And he let her see that none of what she'd said had found purchase. Page 11, he said quietly. Any dining room in any Ashcroft property. I checked. Vivian's chin lifted by a fraction. The spirit of the policy, I know what it says. Still quiet, still even. I work here. She studied him the way she studied balance sheets, looking for the weakness, the pressure point, the number that didn't add up. She found the pressed shirt, the short sleeve, the tie that had seen better years. She found the lunch pail patience in his posture and the absence of any performance of dignity, which in her experience meant either someone who had nothing to lose or someone who had already done the accounting and arrived at peace with the total. She couldn't tell which this was. That bothered her more than she would have admitted. Your maintenance, she said. Not a question, a classification. Third floor mechanical, he confirmed. Then you understand chain of command. Her voice had found its sharpest register now. Not loud, never loud, but precise as a scalpel. You understand that when the owner of a property makes a request, it isn't offered as a suggestion. Caspian held her gaze for one more second. Then he did something she didn't expect. He turned back to his daughter. "The soufflé takes about 20 minutes, he told Nora, who had moved on to a new section of the activity sheet. "So we should order it soon if you want it before it gets late." Nora looked up with the gravity of someone making a binding decision. "Order it now," she said. "I don't want to rush a cloud." He raised his hand for the waiter. Vivian stood there, between the corner table and the rest of the room, between the instruction she'd issued and the complete absence of its effect. And for one unguarded moment, she was simply a woman who had told someone to leave and watch them, gently and absolutely, decline. She returned to her table. The composure was intact. The walk was measured. Nico met her eyes as she sat, and she gave him the smallest shake of her head, which meant, leave it. He left it. A good soldier recognizes when the field has shifted and the original objective has become untenable. Across the room, at the center table, Isla had finished color-coding her crayons and moved on to the placemat itself, drawing something in the corner with the orange crayon. She held it up to show Vivienne. "It's us," Isla said. Vivienne looked at the drawing. Two figures, one tall and one small, rendered in the unambiguous style of a 6-year-old who has not yet learned that art requires apology. The tall figure had what appeared to be a triangle on its head, which Vivian slowly understood was meant to be her hair. "It's very good," Vivian said. Isla went back to drawing. She added something to the corner of the placemat, a third figure, small, with a circle in its arms. "That's the girl with the rabbit," Isla said, without looking up. "She has kind eyes." Vivian looked across the room at the corner table. Caspian was reading the dessert menu aloud to Nora, who was listening with her chin in both hands, utterly absorbed, as if he were narrating something thrilling. Vivian looked away. At her wrist, her watch read 8:47. The evening was still young. She reached for her wineglass and held it without drinking. Isla's crayon moved in quiet circles across the paper. The soufflé order was placed at 8:49. The waiter, young, with the careful neutrality of someone who had witnessed the last 15 minutes and chosen, wisely, to process it later, wrote it down with a small nod and collected the menus. As he turned to leave, he paused, almost involuntarily, and looked at Nora. "Happy birthday," he said, quietly, like it was something he meant. Nora looked up with the full brightness she reserved for people who surprised her pleasantly. "Thank you. I'm 7 now. It's a serious age." The waiter smiled, a real one, not the professional variety, and moved away toward the kitchen, and Caspian watched him go with the particular gratitude of a man who has learned not to expect small kindnesses and therefore notices them completely when they arrive. The restaurant had resettled around them. The couple at table 9 had resumed their conversation. The low music that had been playing the entire evening continued to play, unhurried, indifferent to everything that had happened beneath it. The room had the texture of a place returning to its natural state after a brief disturbance, waters closing over a stone. Caspian exhaled slowly through his nose. He didn't look at the center table. He didn't need to. He knew, with the peripheral precision of someone trained to maintain situational awareness without appearing to, that Vivian Ashcroft was sitting very straight and holding her wine glass and looking at nothing in particular, with the expression of someone replaying a conversation and arriving at the same unsatisfying conclusion each time. He felt no satisfaction in that. What he felt was something more complicated and less comfortable. The low-grade exhaustion of a man who has had to spend energy defending his right to simply exist in a space. Energy that could have gone elsewhere. Energy he didn't have unlimited reserves of. He looked at Nora instead. She had moved on from the activity sheet to a small notebook she carried everywhere. A battered thing with a green cover, half filled with drawings and lists and observations she considered important. She was adding to it now, her handwriting large and very determined, her tongue doing its thing at her upper lip. "What are you writing?" he asked. "The menu," she said, without looking up. "So, I remember it." He watched her write. Her wrist moved with the same focused inefficiency of every 7-year-old who has not yet learned that the goal is the word, not the performance of making it. He had a memory, sudden and uninvited, of sitting across a different table from a different person who wrote the same way. His wife, Maya, making grocery lists with the same total investment, as if each item deserved full attention. It arrived the way those memories always did, not announced, not dramatic, just suddenly present, like a change in the light. Maya had been 36 when the blood clot formed. She'd been in a hospital corridor for 40 minutes before anyone moved with purpose. The doctor who finally reached her was good, genuinely good, and had done everything correctly. But 40 minutes in a corridor is not a detail that belongs in a story with a good ending. Caspian had been deployed. He'd gotten the call at 4 a.m. in a forward operating base outside Kandahar and had understood, from the particular silence on the line before anyone spoke, that the world had just rearranged itself into a before and an after. He had come home. He had held his 2-year-old daughter, who did not understand what had happened but understood that something had, and he had made the only decision that felt like solid ground, that he would never again be somewhere else when Nora needed him, and that he would never again stand in a corridor and wait for someone else to move first. That was the decision he'd carried into civilian life, into the maintenance job that gave him steady hours and proximity to his daughter's school, into the first aid certifications he renewed every year, not because his job required it, but because he required it of himself, into the habit of noting exits and assessing everyone in a room and keeping Nora's inhaler within arm's reach at all times. Preparedness was not fear. It was the thing you built from the rubble of the worst moment of your life, so that the next worst moment, if it came, and he understood better than most people that it always, eventually came, would find you ready. He didn't think about any of this in organized sentences. It lived below language, in the body, in the stillness. Nora finished writing. She closed the notebook and looked at him with Maya's eyes. "Dad," she said, "do you think Admiral wants some bread?" He looked at the rabbit. "I think Admiral would love some bread," he said. She tore a small piece and placed it formally in front of the rabbit. Across the room, at 9:06, Isla set down her orange crayon and pressed both hands flat on the table. The hands on the table were the first sign, not the color that followed, not the breathing. The hands, flat, pressed, fingers slightly spread, the way a person braces when the ground beneath them has become uncertain. Caspian noticed it the way he noticed everything in a room, not with alarm, not yet, but with the particular quality of attention that files something under watch this and keeps moving. He was reaching for his water glass when Isla made the sound. It was small, almost polite. The confused, slightly apologetic sound of a child who has woken somewhere unfamiliar and isn't sure yet whether to be frightened. Her crayon, the orange one, rolled from the table's edge and landed on the marble floor without drama, and the sound it made was somehow the loudest thing in the room. Vivian turned. Isla's face had gone the color of candle wax, not pale in the way children go pale when they're tired or cold. Something more fundamental than that, a draining, as if the body had quietly redirected everything to a more urgent internal problem, and the surface was simply last to know. Her breathing had become rapid and very shallow, the small chest moving too fast, too high, and her dark eyes, her mother's eyes, wide set and taking everything in, were open but not quite focused on anything in the room. Isla. Vivian's voice had lost its precision. Just the name, nothing else. Isla didn't answer correctly. She turned toward the sound, but the movement was slow and slightly off, like a compass needle finding north through interference. Vivian reached toward her. The hand extended, hovered, and stopped. Because this was not a problem with a solution Vivian owned. Her hand knew it before her mind caught up. There was no instruction to give here, no authority to invoke, no version of her considerable power that was legible in this particular emergency. The extended hand became a frozen gesture, suspended in the space between a woman who controlled everything and a moment that controlled her. Nico was already reaching for his phone. The couple at table 9 had gone still. A waiter near the service entrance had turned and not yet moved, caught in the moment before comprehension becomes action. The room had the texture of a collective inhale. And Caspian was already standing. He didn't push his chair back dramatically. He didn't announce himself. He simply stood and moved, with the quiet directional certainty of someone whose body has a different relationship with emergencies than most people's bodies do. Not the freeze, not the panic, just the immediate, almost mechanical orientation toward the problem. 7 years of civilian life had not touched this. It was deeper than habit. It was architecture. He was at Isla's side in 4 steps. "Give her room," he said, not loudly. The voice carried anyway. It had a frequency that rooms respond to, the register of someone who is not asking. "Don't move her." He crouched beside the chair and had Isla's wrist in his fingers before anyone had processed that he'd arrived. He counted. He observed the pulse, rapid, irregular, the rhythm of a heart that had lost its organizing principle and was improvising badly. He checked her color, her responsiveness, the quality of her breathing. He placed one hand lightly at the side of her neck and confirmed what the wrist had told him. He knew what this was. SVT, supraventricular tachycardia. The heart's upper chambers firing out of sequence, too fast, overwhelming the system with a rhythm the body couldn't sustain. He'd seen it twice in the field, once in a 14-year-old interpreter in Kandahar, once in a soldier on his 3rd deployment who'd insisted he was fine right up until he wasn't. It was not, in itself, a death sentence. It was a clock. "What's your name?" he asked Isla, his voice dropping to the register he used when he needed someone frightened to stay present. Her eyes found his. "Isla," she whispered. "Good. Isla, I need you to listen to my voice and do exactly what I tell you. Can you do that?" The smallest nod. I'm going to need you to take a breath and hold it for me, deep as you can, like you're about to go underwater. Vivian made a sound beside him. Who are you? She managed. The voice that had dissected him across a restaurant 40 minutes ago was unrecognizable now, stripped of its temperature, its precision, its absolute conviction about where things belonged. What remained was just a woman who was afraid. He didn't look up. "She's with me," he said. And in the ringing silence that followed, if you knew what those words had meant the first time he'd said them tonight, and everyone in that room did, you understood that something had just shifted on its axis and would not be shifting back. If you've ever watched someone dismissed and underestimated step forward in the exact moment it mattered most, subscribe and hit that bell. This is the moment the story turns, and you don't want to miss what happens next. Isla held her breath. She did it the way children do when they trust the person asking, completely, without negotiation, pulling the air in and holding it with both hands the way you hold something you're afraid to drop. Her small chest stilled. Her eyes stayed on Caspian's face with the focused, slightly desperate attention of someone who has decided that this particular person is the fixed point in a tilting room and intends to keep him in sight. He counted silently, watched her color, kept 2 fingers at her wrist. The pulse didn't convert on the first attempt. He didn't show that. His face remained exactly what it needed to be: calm, present, organized. Because he understood, from years of working in environments where the patient reads the medic's expression before they read anything else, that the most important clinical instrument he had right now was not his hands. It was the information his face was giving this child about whether she was going to be all right. "Good," he said when she released the breath. "That was good. You did well." Isla exhaled shakily. "Is something wrong with me?" "Your heart is beating too fast," he told her, with the particular honesty he reserved for children, which was total and uncomplicated and delivered without the adult instinct to soften facts into uselessness. "We're going to slow it down. It's going to be fine." "How do you know?" "Because I've done this before," he said. "And I need you to trust me for about 90 more seconds. Can you do 90 seconds? She considered this, with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes." "Good girl." He adjusted her position slightly, reclined in the chair, feet flat, shoulders dropped, and spoke her through the second attempt. Slower this time. The bearing down technique, the vagal maneuver, the intervention that costs nothing and requires only the body doing what the body already knows how to do when it's guided correctly. He talked her through each second of it in a voice so steady it functioned less like instruction and more like a hand on the shoulder. 45 seconds in, he felt it. The flutter first, the heart's brief, confused argument with itself. And then the pause, the reset, and then the rhythm coming back online, slower, organized. The electrical system finding its pattern again, like a conductor lifting a baton into chaos and silence, falling in response. He didn't close his eyes. He didn't exhale visibly. He just held the count for 10 more seconds to confirm it, and then he said, quietly, "There you go. There she is." Isla blinked. The color in her face was already beginning to return, the slow tide of it, pink replacing wax. Her breathing had stopped racing. She looked at her own hands on the table as if they belonged to her again. "That feels different," she said. "Better different," he said. "Yes." He kept his fingers at her wrist. He would keep them there until someone with a stethoscope confirmed what his hands already knew. He positioned her gently so her airway was clear and her posture wasn't fighting her recovery, and he spoke to her in a low, continuous murmur, asking her name again, her age, what she'd drawn on the placemat, the ordinary questions that keep a person tethered to the present moment, when the present moment has just been very frightening. The room around them had not resumed. It was held in the suspension of people who have witnessed something they don't have the vocabulary for yet. Not a disaster, it turned out, but close enough to one that the difference felt like grace. Nico stood 3 feet away with his phone half raised, the emergency services number dialed, but not yet connected. "Hotel physician," Caspian said to him without turning. "And call down to the front desk. Ask if there's a medical professional staying on any of the upper floors. Don't use the word emergency on the floor. Use assistance requested." Nico moved immediately. The instruction had the quality of something that didn't require agreement, only execution, and his feet understood this before his brain had finished processing the source. Vivian had not moved. She was standing where she had been standing when Caspian arrived. The same coordinates, the same extended hand now lowered to her side. She was watching him with an expression that had no name in the vocabulary she'd spent her life constructing. Not gratitude, not yet. Not shame, not exactly. Something rawer than either. The expression of a person watching the ground shift beneath a belief they didn't know they were standing on until it moved. Caspian did not look at her. He looked at Isla, whose pulse was steady now beneath his fingers, whose color was returning, who had just asked him in a very small voice whether he thought Admiral the Rabbit had a good view from the breadbasket. He almost smiled. "I think Admiral has the best seat in the house," he said. Admiral did not comment on his view. But Nora, who had moved from the corner table at some point during the last 90 seconds with the quiet self-direction of a child who understands when a situation has become serious, was standing at the edge of the scene with the rabbit pressed against her chest and her eyes very wide and very focused on her father. She didn't speak. She didn't ask questions. She simply stood where she could see him and held Admiral with both arms and watched, with the particular stillness of a child who has learned that when her father moves like that, with that direction, that economy, that absolute absence of uncertainty, the correct thing to do is stay out of the way and let him work. She had learned this not from being told, but from being 7 years old and paying attention. The hotel physician arrived 4 minutes later, a compact, gray-haired man named Dr. Ellison, who carried his bag with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to being summoned at inconvenient hours. He took in the scene with a single professional sweep, noted Caspian's position and the 2 fingers still at Isla's wrist, and moved to the opposite side of the chair. They exchanged information in the shorthand of people who speak the same clinical language: pulse rate on presentation, duration of episode, intervention used, current rhythm. Caspian delivered each detail with the clean precision of a field report. No editorializing, no uncertainty, no gaps, and Dr. Ellison listened with the quality of attention that medical professionals reserve for sources they've decided within the first 10 seconds are reliable. He produced a stethoscope. He confirmed. He asked 2 follow-up questions, received 2 precise answers, and sat back slightly with the expression of a man doing rapid, favorable arithmetic. "Converted," he said. "About 6 minutes ago," Caspian said, Held steady since. Dr. Ellison nodded slowly. He looked at Caspian with a reassessment that was almost visible, a recalibration happening in real time behind steady eyes. She needs cardiology follow-up, he said. Tonight, I'd recommend observation. There's a suite on the 4th floor we use for... Agreed, Caspian said. He stepped back then, creating space for the physician to take primary position, because that was correct protocol and because that was the kind of man he was. The one who steps forward when stepping forward is needed, and steps back the moment someone more appropriate is present to step forward. No performance. No lingering in the center of what he'd done. Just the clean handoff. It was at this precise moment that Dr. Priya Voss arrived. She had been finishing dinner at a table near the window when the shift in the room's atmosphere had reached her the way these things reach doctors. Not as a sound or a sight, but as a change in pressure, a professional frequency she'd spent 20 years learning to receive. She'd moved toward it without deciding to, her napkin still in her hand when she reached the cluster of people around Ixla's chair. She assessed quickly, spoke briefly with Dr. Ellison, then turned to Caspian with the direct, evaluating look of someone whose profession runs on accurate information and cannot afford social politeness in its place. "What was your read on presentation?" she asked. "SVT, narrow complex, ventricular rate around 210 on palpation. No syncope, but pre-syncopal." She was close. Dr. Voss absorbed this without expression. "Vagal maneuver? Modified Valsalva, second attempt converted." She was quiet for a moment. Looked at Isla, who was now sitting upright with better color and was asking Dr. Ellison whether his stethoscope was cold before he used it, which he confirmed it was, and which she accepted with great philosophical resignation. Dr. Voss looked back at Caspian. "Special operations medic?" she asked. He met her eyes. 8 years. She nodded once, the specific nod of a professional acknowledging a peer, and turned to assist Dr. Ellison with the documentation. No fanfare, no elaboration. The question and answer had been their own complete transaction, but the room had heard it. The couple at table 9 had heard it. The waiter near the service entrance had heard it. Nico, standing 6 feet away with his phone finally lowered, had heard it. The 3 people at the table beside Vivienne's, who had been motionless since Isla set down her crayon, had heard every word. The dining room of the Ashcroft Grand had, over the course of 8 minutes, learned something about the man from the corner table that rearranged the entire evening in retrospect. Nora had heard it too. She was still standing at the edge of the scene, Admiral against her chest, watching her father with the uncomplicated certainty of someone for whom this information was not new and had never been surprising and required no rearrangement of anything at all. She already knew what he was. She'd always known. Caspian crossed back to the corner table and pulled out Nora's chair. She climbed into it without being asked, settled Admiral back against the breadbasket in his proper position, and looked at her father across the small table with the focused attention of someone who has several questions and is organizing them in order of importance. "Is she going to be okay?" Nora asked. "Yes," he said. No qualification, no softening. He'd learned early that children process honesty better than they process reassurance that turns out to be wrong, and he'd never given Nora a version of the truth that was smaller than she could handle. She studied his face for a moment, checking it the way she always checked it. Not for the words, but for the thing beneath the words. She found what she was looking for. She nodded once, with the gravity of someone closing a file. "Okay," she said, and picked up her fork. The souffle had arrived at some point during everything, placed quietly at the edge of the table by a waiter who had the good sense to leave without comment. It had deflated slightly, the way soufflés do when the world doesn't stop for them, but it was still there, still warm, still unmistakably the thing Nora had requested with 6 weeks of anticipation. She looked at it. "It fell a little," she said. "They do that." "Does it still taste like a cloud?" Only one way to find out. She took a bite with the ceremonial attention the moment deserved. Chewed. Considered. Her expression moved through several stages of evaluation before arriving at its conclusion. "It tastes like a cloud that's been in a warm room," she said, "which is actually better." He watched her eat and felt something in his chest that didn't have a clean name. The compound thing, the one made from equal parts exhaustion and love, and the particular relief of a man who has just spent 8 minutes in a place where everything mattered and has returned to a place where a slightly deflated souffle is the most important issue on the table. He reached for his coffee. It was cold. He drank it anyway. Across the room, the choreography of aftermath was playing out in its various forms. Dr. Ellison and Dr. Voss were coordinating the arrangement of the 4th-floor suite. 2 waitstaff had repositioned discreetly to manage the flow of other diners, most of whom had returned to their own evenings with the slightly dazed quality of people who have witnessed something they'll be describing for weeks. Nico stood near the service entrance with the look of a man who has survived an evening he did not sign up for and is beginning to understand it isn't over yet. And Vivian Ashcroft sat at her table. She had not moved to follow Isla. Dr. Ellison had gently indicated that Isla was stable and the move upstairs would take a few minutes to arrange, that she should remain calm and he would return to escort them both. So she sat, upright, composed, hands folded on the table in front of her, with the deliberate placement of a person who needs something to do with their hands and has chosen stillness as the most defensible option. She was looking at the corner table. Not with the cataloging attention she'd applied earlier in the evening, the 4-second assessment that assigned and filed and concluded. This was different. This was the looking of a person who has had the lens pulled from their eye and is seeing the same image without it for the first time, and finding the difference disorienting in a way that simple embarrassment doesn't account for. Caspian had his back to her. She was looking at the shape of his shoulders, relaxed now, the particular release of a man whose body had been at full operational tension and has stood down, and at the way he leaned slightly toward his daughter when she said something, and at the child herself, who had chocolate on her lip and was telling him something with great animation involving hand gestures. The contrast between what she had said to him 40 minutes ago and what he had done 9 minutes ago was not something Vivian could organize into a comfortable shape. She had tried. She was still trying. It kept coming out wrong. If this story is reminding you that the people we dismiss are often the ones carrying the most, subscribe and hit the bell, because what Vivian does next, and what Caspian says when she finally faces him, is the part of this story that'll stay with you long after it ends. Nico appeared at her elbow. "Ms. Ashcroft, the suite is ready whenever you are." She didn't stand. Immediately. Her eyes moved one more time to the corner table, where Nora had just placed a small piece of souffle carefully in front of Admiral, because, apparently, clouds were something rabbits could also appreciate. Then Vivian stood, smoothed her dress, and walked toward the elevator. She did not look composed. She looked like someone practicing it. the elevator doors had closed behind Vivian 7 minutes ago. The dining room had settled into the comfortable murmur of a place that has processed its drama and returned to the business of dessert and conversation. The couple at table 9 were laughing at something. The waiter near the service entrance had resumed his normal orbit. The music, which had been playing the entire evening without anyone noticing, continued to play. Nora had finished the souffle and was now working on a cup of hot chocolate that the kitchen had sent out unrequested, with a small biscuit balanced on the saucer and a single marshmallow floating in the center with the self-satisfied air of something that knows it belongs there. She was telling Caspian about a bird she'd seen on the way to school 3 days ago. He was listening the way he always listened to her, fully, without the adult habit of partial attention, without one eye on his phone or one ear on the room. Just present, turned toward her, his coffee cup held in both hands. She was describing the bird's particular color with increasing precision, unsatisfied with every word she tried, working towards something exact. It was blue, she said, but not regular blue, like if blue was trying to be something else but hadn't decided what yet. Indigo, he said. She tested the word. Indigo, she repeated, and something in her expression settled, the way expressions settle when language finally catches up to experience. That's it, indigo. He had just set down his cup when the elevator doors opened. He knew it was her before he turned. Not from sound. The lobby was quiet, and her footsteps on marble were measured and deliberate, and told him nothing he didn't already understand about how she moved through spaces. He knew it the way you know certain things after a long evening, by the change in the room's atmosphere, the slight reconfiguration of attention among the remaining staff, the way Nico, who had been speaking to a colleague near the service entrance, went very still. Vivian walked across the dining room. She was not moving the way she'd moved when she arrived, that reorganizing the room quality, the expectation of accommodation. She was moving more carefully now, not hesitantly, carefully, the way a person moves when they are not certain of their reception and have decided to proceed anyway. She stopped at the corner table. Caspian looked up at her. He didn't stand. He didn't arrange his expression into anything in particular. He just looked with the same level attention he'd given her earlier in the evening, before any of it. Vivian stood at the edge of the corner table in the $1,200 dress and looked at his daughter. Nora looked back at her with the direct, unguarded curiosity of a child who hasn't yet learned that there are people you're supposed to look at carefully before you look at them openly. She took in the tall woman with the precise hair and the expression she couldn't quite name, and she waited, because her father had taught her that waiting was often the most respectful thing you could do. "I don't know your name," Vivian said. Her voice was different from every version it had been tonight. Not soft exactly. She didn't do soft with any fluency, but cleared of its weaponry. What remained was just the voice underneath, which turned out to be quieter than expected. "Caspian Morel," he said. "Maintenance, 3rd floor mechanical." He said it the same way he'd said it to Dr. Voss. Plain, accurate, without apology and without performance and without the slight inflation people add to humble facts when they're trying to make them sound like something else. Vivian's throat moved. She looked at Nora again, and something crossed her face in the space between 1 second and the next. A movement beneath the composure, brief and unguarded, the kind of expression a person makes when they are in private and don't know they're being watched. Except she was in public, and she did know, and it happened anyway. She was measuring something. The distance between what she had said at this table earlier and what had happened at her own table 9 minutes later. The distance between the man she'd decided he was and the man who had been at her niece's side before the room had even understood there was a crisis. The distance between what she'd almost caused to be lost, Isla, small and trusting and drawing orange figures on a placemat, and what she had nearly discarded without knowing its value. It was not a short distance. Isla asked about you, she said finally. 3 times. She wanted to know the name of the man with the glasses. He said nothing. He waited. She said, Vivian paused, recalibrated, continued. She said you talked to her like she was a person. The weight of that sentence arrived in the corner of the room and sat down and did not leave. Caspian looked at Vivian Ashcroft, at the woman who had told him he was a problem, who had tried to remove him and his daughter from a room they had every right to occupy, who had stood frozen at her own table while a child needed help. And he found, beneath the exhaustion and the complexity of the evening, no desire to make her feel worse than she already did. She is a person, he said simply. She did well tonight. Vivian nodded once. The nod of someone receiving something they know they don't deserve and accepting it anyway, because not accepting it would be a second cruelty layered on the first. She turned to Nora. Your name, she said, quietly. Not a demand this time. Something else. Nora, said Nora, because she was 7 and honest and saw no reason to be anything but. Vivian looked at her, at the chocolate on her lip, at Admiral in the breadbasket, at the green notebook on the table, at the small biscuit from the hot chocolate saucer that Nora had apparently also given to the rabbit. And something in her expression did the thing it had been doing all evening, that slow rearrangement, that structural shift. Happy birthday, Nora, she said. 3 words, no preamble, no qualification, no performance of warmth she hadn't earned yet, just the words placed in front of the child like something being returned to its rightful owner. Nora looked up at her with Maya's eyes. Thank you, she said. Because Caspian had raised her right, and because she was 7, and because she understood, in the way children understand things that adults have to work years to learn, that when someone offers you something real, you receive it the same way. Vivienne walked out of the dining room. The door settled behind her without drama. The room filled back in around the corner table. The clink of cutlery, someone laughing near the bar, the music that had been playing the entire time and that nobody had noticed. Caspian sat with his cold coffee and his daughter and the stuffed rabbit, who had now received portions of soufflé, bread, and biscuit. Dad, Nora said. She seemed sad. He looked at his daughter, at the way she'd arrived at that observation, not with judgment in it, just with the plain noticing of someone who pays attention. Maya's way, the same quiet accuracy about people. I think she had a hard night, he said. Nora considered this. We should have invited her for dessert, she said. That's what you do when someone's having a hard night. He looked at her for a long moment. Next time, he said. She accepted this and returned to her hot chocolate. The marshmallow had dissolved. She stirred it in without mourning it, the small philosophical grace of someone who understands that some things change, and the hot chocolate is still good. They stayed another 20 minutes. Not because there was anything left to order, and not because either of them was stalling, but because the evening had earned its ending, and endings, Caspian had learned, shouldn't be rushed any more than beginnings should be skipped. Nora finished her hot chocolate. He finished a second cup of coffee that was also cold and that he also drank without complaint. The restaurant continued its quiet wind down around them, the particular unhurried diminishment of a fine dining room approaching its last hour. Candles lower, conversation softer, the staff moving with the relaxed efficiency of people who can see the finish line. Nora had returned to her green notebook. She was drawing now rather than writing. Her crayon, the blue one, the indigo one she'd identified earlier and borrowed from the activity sheet without asking, because it was the exact right color and she needed it, moving in careful loops across a fresh page. He didn't ask what it was. He'd learned that asking interrupted the thing itself, and the thing itself was always more interesting than any description of it. The waiter came by one final time. He placed the bill folder on the table with the quiet apology of someone who knows the gesture is procedural but feels it anyway. Then he paused, just briefly, with the look of a man who has been carrying something all evening and has decided the evening is almost over and he might as well set it down. "For what it's worth," he said, low enough that it was only for the corner table. "What you did tonight, that was something." Caspian looked up at him. "I hope the little girl is okay," the waiter added. "She will be," Caspian said. The waiter nodded and moved away, and Caspian opened the bill folder out of habit and found it empty. Just a small card, cream-colored, the Ashcroft Grand. Letterhead at the top, and 4 handwritten words in the controlled script of someone who has spent a lifetime signing documents. "This evening is settled. No name, no elaboration. Just the 4 words and the implied weight of everything they were standing in for." He closed the folder, set it aside, drank the last of his cold coffee. Nora closed her notebook. "Ready?" he said. She looked around the dining room one final time with the slow, deliberate attention of someone committing a place to memory. The candles, the marble, the cloth napkins she had been correct about. Admiral, retrieved from the breadbasket and tucked under her arm with the practiced ease of long companionship. "Ready," she said. They left through the side entrance, the one that connected the restaurant corridor to the hotel lobby, the route that took them past the service elevator and the staff lockers, and the door that led to the maintenance corridor where Caspian spent his working days. He knew every step of it in the dark. He'd walked it 5 days a week for 3 years and never once thought of it as anything other than where he belonged. Tonight it felt different, not larger, not more significant in any architectural sense. Just known in a way that had been complicated this evening and had come out the other side of the complication still standing. Nora fell asleep before they reached the lobby. It happened the way it always happened with her, not gradually, not with warning, but completely, between one step and the next, her body making the executive decision that the day was finished and implementing it without consultation. He felt the change in her weight against his shoulder and adjusted his arm and carried her and Admiral both through the lobby and out into the night air. The city was quiet in the way cities are quiet after 10, not silent, never silent, but running on lower registers, the daytime frequency replaced by something slower and more intermittent. Streetlights on wet pavement, a car moving 2 blocks over, the distant conversation of people outside a restaurant they passed, their voices carrying the loose warmth of a good evening nearly finished. He walked. Nora's head was heavy on his shoulder in the specific way of a sleeping child. Absolute, boneless, the total trust of someone who has outsourced their safety entirely and gone elsewhere. He'd carried her like this since she was 2 years old. The weight had changed. The trust hadn't. He thought about Maya, not with the sharp-edged grief that had defined the first years. That was duller now, worn smooth by time and daily life and the continuous project of raising their daughter. What he thought about tonight was her laugh, the specific one she deployed when something struck her as both terrible and funny, which was a combination she'd had a particular affinity for. She would have found this evening, the whole of it, the voucher policy, the souffle, the frozen, heiress, the rabbit receiving biscuit portions, absolutely, precisely her kind of story. He could almost hear the laugh. He shifted Nora's weight slightly and kept walking. He thought about Isla, upstairs in the fourth-floor suite, presumably asleep or close to it, her small heart beating in its correct rhythm, the one it had been persuaded back to with breath and steadiness, and the accumulated knowledge of 8 years spent in places where you learned things the hard way or not at all. She would need a cardiologist. She would need monitoring. She would need her mother to be told, which would be a complicated conversation for Vivian to have in the morning. And Vivian would have it because Vivian, whatever else she was, clearly loved that child. He thought about that, about how love doesn't organize itself according to the other qualities of the person carrying it, how it doesn't wait for someone to be good or humble or correct before it attaches, how Vivian had stood, frozen at that table, not from coldness, but from the exact opposite, from the specific paralysis of someone encountering the limits of their power at the precise moment their power was the only thing standing between them and total loss. He didn't forgive her for the earlier part of the evening, because forgiveness wasn't something he decided to withhold. It was something he simply hadn't needed to deploy. What she'd done had glanced off him, the way certain things glance off people who have a settled relationship with their own worth. It had found no purchase. The damage she'd intended hadn't arrived. What had arrived instead was a souffle, slightly deflated, and a child's birthday, intact. Nora made a sound in her sleep, not distress, just the small conversational murmur of someone active in a dream, and tightened her grip on Admiral without waking. He turned the corner onto their street. Their building was a 4-story walk-up on a street that had never been fashionable, and didn't appear to have ambitions in that direction. The hallway smelled of Mrs. Okafor's cooking from the 2nd floor, something with cardamom in it, warm and specific, and the 3rd stair from the top still creaked the way it had always creaked, which Caspian had been meaning to fix for 8 months, and which Nora had specifically asked him not to, because she liked knowing the sound was there in the dark, liked having something reliable to step on and hear respond. He carried her up all 3 flights without waking her. He was good at this. He'd had 7 years of practice, the geometry of door frames and sleeping children, the particular art of the transfer from shoulder to mattress, the way you had to commit to the movement rather than hesitate, because hesitation was what woke them. He laid Nora down, worked her shoes off without incident, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and stood in the half-dark of her room for a moment, listening to her breathe. Steady, even. The small, reliable machinery of her. He placed Admiral beside her on the pillow. The rabbit stared at the ceiling with its usual philosophical composure. He pulled the door to, not shut, and went to the kitchen and stood at the counter in the dark for a while without turning the light on. The city made its quiet sounds through the window, someone's music a few floors up, the hydraulic sigh of a bus stopping on the corner, rain beginning on the glass with the tentative quality of rain that isn't sure yet whether it means it. He made tea he didn't especially want and stood with it at the window. 3 weeks later, an envelope appeared at the maintenance desk on the 3rd floor. It was addressed in the controlled handwriting he recognized from the card in the bill folder. The same script, the same deliberate pressure of someone for whom every written word is a small act of governance. His name, his department. No return address, though it didn't need one. Inside was a handwritten note. 4 sentences, which he read once and then set down on the workbench beside a pressure gauge he'd been recalibrating. No apology in the conventional sense. No architecture of self-justification or explanation. Just 4 sentences that acknowledged, in plain language, what had happened and what it had cost, and what she understood now that she hadn't understood then. The last sentence said that Isla's cardiologist appointment had confirmed the diagnosis, that treatment had been arranged, and that the prognosis was excellent. Beneath the note were 2 tickets: Natural History Museum, Saturday admission, the dinosaur exhibition that had opened 3 weeks ago, the one Nora had seen advertised in a city guide she'd been carrying around for a month. The guide she'd left on the corner table at the Ashcroft Grand the night of her birthday, in which she had circled, in red crayon, 3 things she wanted to do before she turned 8. The dinosaur exhibition was circled twice. He took Nora on a Saturday in the middle of October, when the light came through the museum's tall windows at the angle that makes everything inside look like it's been gilded. She wore her yellow coat and carried Admiral in her backpack, because the sign at the entrance said no stuffed animals in the fossil gallery, and she respected rules she considered reasonable. She stood in front of the largest skeleton for a long time without speaking. He stood beside her and did not rush her. "Dad," she said finally. "Yeah, it was alive. It was. And now it's just the shape of it, the part that stayed." He looked at the bones rising toward the ceiling, the vast, improbable architecture of something that had existed and then stopped and left this behind. The outline of itself, the calcium record of having been real. "That's right," he said. Nora thought about this for another moment. Then she reached up and took his hand, the way she did when she was processing something large and wanted to be connected to something solid while she did it. They stood like that for a while, the shape of what stays, the outline of what mattered. 4 words said twice in a single evening that meant protection the first time and something larger the second. And between them, a child's birthday kept intact, a small heart returned to its rhythm, and the quiet, persistent truth that the people the world places where power never looks are sometimes carrying everything the moment will need. Some things resolve slowly, without ceremony. In October light, with a child's hand in yours and a rabbit in her backpack and the enormous bones of something ancient reminding you that existing fully, being present and skilled and unhurried and dignified, is the only record that lasts. That's what She's With Me was always about. Not a dinner, not a reversal, not a billionaire humbled or a working man vindicated. Though it was all of those things too. It was about a father who already knew his worth in a room full of people who were about to learn it, and a little girl named Nora, who picked well. What story should we tell next? Drop your suggestions in the comments below. What injustice should we tackle? What underdog deserves their moment? Tell me, and subscribe, and don't miss our next story. Trust me, you'll feel it.